Today I want to talk about culturally relevant and culturally responsive teaching. And you see on the screen here, I've pulled up definitions from an unlikely source. The National Science Teaching Association. I've done that intentionally. I could have pulled it from anywhere. I could have pulled it from Ladson Billings herself, but I thought it would be important to show you how widely this has been embraced, even in the STEM field, even in teaching science. So you aren't laboring under the delusion that this is only in the humanities or social sciences or maybe confined to SEL class or whatever that is, maybe even ELA, English language arts, for those of you who don't know what that is, but I guess that would count as a humanities subject in any event. I just thought it would be more oomphy to use this source. But I want to talk about it today because, as often happens, a question popped into my head that I don't think many people have asked, and that is, when you're deciding how to make your teaching culturally relevant, how do you decide what cultures to choose? Like, how do you pick the relevant ones? How they do that? I'm going to read you the definition as, written by the inventor of it or the creator of it, Gloria Ladson Billings, and see if you can hear what they would suggest we use. And then I'm going to comment on that. And then I'm going to ask a couple more questions about why no one has noticed what's glaringly missing from our efforts to make teachers and students culturally competent by using, or literate, they sometimes say, by using this framework or this method of teaching. Before I get into this, I would like to ask you to please consider subscribing to this channel. It helps me do my work. It supports me tremendously. Also, like, comment, and share the video. And consider joining my locals community at thereasonwelearn.locals.com, where I provide you with all kinds of resources to help transition away from institutional school settings, if you so choose, not just homeschooling, but other things as well. And lots of supporter-only content over there, including 2 weekly live streams and a private Zoom once a week. So, having said all that and promoted my channel and my platforms, let's move on to talking about culturally relevant and culturally responsive teaching and what that all means. Okay, so Gloria Ladson Billings and Geneva Gay are two prominent figures in education whose work on culturally relevant teaching and culturally responsive teaching, respectively, has been very influential in the work I do supporting student learning and academic success for students of diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds and the teachers who teach them. Take a breath. The two frameworks have been used extensively across multiple fields and subject areas, as I just said, including science education, pre-service education, teacher professional development, curriculum development, and student learning. Due to this familiarity of these frameworks in education, it is fitting that culturally relevant and culturally responsive teaching are highlighted in this special issue of Science and Children. The two frameworks come from different philosophical orientations, while they also share common goals. Thus, it is worth laying some foundational knowledge of them while giving attention that both are focused on culture, race, equity, and the success of students traditionally marginalized in the education system. So here we have it. Both, I'm not really sure how different they are, culturally relevant and culturally responsive, are focused on culture, race, equity, and the success of students traditionally marginalized in the education system. So they're hinting at the premise that your culture, whatever that is and however we figure that out, your race, something called equity, which I've noticed is loosely defined as more equal outcomes, less disparity in the outcomes, equal access, which of course is reflected in the outcomes. The only way we know that equal access, we're told, is the outcomes are closer, the gaps are narrower or non-existent, and so on. So that somehow that all ties in with success. They're not successful because their culture, their race, are different, and that we need to teach them based on those things. They need to learn differently because of their culture and their race in order to have equal outcomes. Now, when I think about that, that sounds insulting to me. I also think there's ample data to show that's simply not true. That's just not true. Okay, so that's not to say that you can't point to some racially segregated schools of the past and say, wow, I think the school was Dunbar High, I think was the name of it, in the DC area, not far from the Supreme Court where they decided Brown v. Board. Anyway, that school was all Black and turned out more college graduates, master's degree and PhD professionals than its nearby white counterpart. But the supposition here is that it did so because the teachers were teaching in some kind of different, unique Black way. And as you'll see, teaching sort of Black information or Black culture or whatever that is. And yet, if you go back and look at that school and how they taught, you'll find that is not the case at all. It was quite classical, actually. Anyway, moving right along. So I'm going to skip over this. I'll put the link to this in the description box. I just want to get to where it talks about, and see if I missed it already, where it talks about what she says. Okay, so here she says, culturally relevant teaching. First, the theoretical and practical knowledge that helped to form a theory of culturally relevant teaching originated from Ladson Billings' work to capture the pedagogical excellence of successful teachers of Black students. Now, as I continue, remember that you will hear teachers talking about using culturally relevant teaching and culturally responsive teaching in heterogeneous classrooms that are not segregated. So either they're saying teach your Black students differently than your other students, or they're suggesting that the teachers should somehow identify the special cultures of all the students and teach each of them differently. Not really sure, but definitely the Black students. Definitely the Black students. That's what I'm hearing. From conducting ethnographic interviews with teachers, viewing videos of classroom teaching, and working with teachers who also served as researchers in their classrooms, Ladson Billings began formulating notions of culturally relevant teaching. In her seminal book, The Dream Keepers, 2009, she wanted to capture and address student achievement and challenge deficit views about African American students and their academic success. Now, I wonder what deficit views she was challenging. Because I was taught, or I went to graduate school rather. I wouldn't say I was taught to teach, but I went to graduate school in 1989, 1990, and I was not taught anything about any deficits amongst African American students. Nothing. If anything, I was just taught about some of the challenges they face if they are coming from a socioeconomic status level where they're not growing up in a home where somebody goes to work every day, so there's not an alarm clock to get them up, and they don't have a regular routine, and their lives are very different. There's a book called The Truly Disadvantaged. I think it's by Tracy Kidder, where we read that book in graduate school, and we learned how children who are disadvantaged, as they say, in terms of living in poverty, with unemployed parents or underemployed parents, have different life experiences and come to the classroom differently prepared or less prepared for the structure of the classroom, and that we as teachers should take that into account if and when we find ourselves teaching students from those backgrounds. Race wasn't really a big component. I mean, they did say there was a high correlation, but we could have ended up teaching poor white children who came from a similar background, and we should be mindful of that. But nothing was taught as if there was a specific deficit that resided in the skin color. None. Never taught that. Never taught anything about that. Okay. So I don't know what she's talking about in that respect. Maybe I missed it. Was absent that day. Other teachers could weigh in and tell me what this deficit thing was, but okay, she was challenging some deficit views. Ladson Billings defined culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally relevant teaching as a theoretical model that not only addresses student achievement, but also helps students to accept and affirm their cultural identity while developing critical perspectives that challenge inequities that schools and other institutions perpetuate. So what I hear there is that we need to affirm their cultural identities if we can readily identify what it is, or that the student will know. Does a 6-year-old know their cultural identity is? No, the adults have to tell them. How are they going to find out? Well, it's probably going to identify by superficial characteristics like the color of their skin or the language they speak in the home or in the classroom or whatever, if it's not standard English. Possibly their religion, if there's some outward expression of that. But even so, it sounds like they're saying accept and affirm their cultural identity as if they all have one, and as if it's different than whatever the cultural identity is of most of the people in the classroom or the people who produce the material you're going to teach or something. There's a lot of assumption going on in there, and you've got to first accept and affirm it. Again, implication that they feel like they're not accepted and affirmed, that there's something negative going on right away. I don't necessarily think that's true. And then while developing critical perspectives, now notice the word critical. I've said on this channel many times, when you see the word critical, do not hear critical like, let's think about this. And of course, again, the student, the little 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, what's their critical perspective? No, that's not what it means. This goes back to critical pedagogy. What this means is not think critically. This means be critical of. Look to dissect and tear down. Look to find fault with. Okay? So to have a perspective that is critical of and challenges inequities that the schools perpetuate. How would the children know this if not told by their teachers? They wouldn't. There's no way they would know this. Culturally relevant teaching is a way to empower students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically. Did you know that's why you're sending your student to school? To be empowered from the age of 6 or 7 onward, to be socially, emotionally, and politically empowered by using cultural reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So, okay, cultural reference. What does that exactly mean? Are we talking about using hip hop to teach English, to teach vocabulary, use some rap to get across some ideas? I mean, what? And who picks them? Who gets to pick those cultural reference to impart the knowledge? Very curious about how that would work and how the teacher would know. And I'm imagining it's going to be helpfully provided in curriculum materials produced by people like, Learning for Justice and Black Lives Matter in the Classroom and things like that. And I'm sure the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation will helpfully produce some other stuff, and Panorama Ed and Castle and Howard Zinn. All these people will helpfully provide those cultural reference. They're going to pick and choose. You may not know what they are. And again, you're sitting back reading this going, oh, that's good. That's going to be anti-racist. They'll find things that are just really culturally relevant for Black people. Do you hear that? What does that mean? They're denying that they would ever possibly be part of the dominant culture, which is Western Enlightenment culture. That can't be. They're Black. Do you see how insulting that is? They must have a separate culture that they need to be taught through or they can't learn. That's what it implies. The nature of student-teacher relationships cannot be addressed without teachers getting to know the multiple identities of their students. Do you really think these small children walk into class with multiple identities, or do you think they're assigned and projected onto the students? Think about that for a little while. Furthermore, a teacher who enacts culturally relevant pedagogy teaches and believes that students of all racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds can achieve academically. Well, who wouldn't? Shouldn't that go without saying? Why wouldn't you automatically believe that? Why do I need to teach using a specific kind of pedagogy that affirms all of these separate things, that kind of increases the separateness of these students who have superficial differences? Why do I need to do that to believe that they can all learn? That's insulting the teachers and it's insulting the students. They're human beings. I take it as a given they can all learn. Okay, moving right along. Science and curriculum can and should connect these identities. Why? That's just a statement thrown in the middle of the paragraph. Science and curriculum can and should connect these identities. I'm not going to explain why. I'm just moving right along. Furthermore, a teacher who enacts culturally relevant pedagogy teaches and believes the student... Oh, I already said that. I'm sorry. Skip that other sentence and you should have heard it before. My bad. The teacher acknowledges that students have numerous ways to demonstrate cultural competence. This is the one I want to talk about the most in this video, by the way, the cultural competence piece. And that the teacher, as well as the student, understands and critiques how society and education work in unjust ways. The student understands and critiques how society and education work in unjust ways. So premise, society and education are unjust. Our goal of teaching is to make sure the student and the teacher, by the way, understands that our opinion is the correct one to hold. Do you hear it? So no longer is teaching about acquiring knowledge, learning facts, being able to use knowledge to solve problems or to grow as a learner or as a human being, not to develop character, universal character traits that serve the individual well in their life so they can thrive on planet Earth and be productive and happy. No, it's not the goal. It's not the goal. You see, culturally relevant pedagogy is based on 3 propositions: academic success, cultural competence, I'm going to come back to that again, and socio-political consciousness. Did you think you were sending your kids to school for socio-political consciousness? What is that even? What is that exactly? Well, there's a little figure. Let's click on it. What does it show us? Figure 1. Where? Didn't take me to, oh, here it is, figure 1. Here, culturally relevant. They just show us her books. Student learning achievement, cultural competence, critical consciousness. Oh, pretty. You made a picture out of your sentence. Oh, that's great. Anyway, thus she argues that culturally relevant pedagogy is just good teaching. How convenient for the person who wrote the books. What if I disagree? What if I disagree? What if I say you can be a really good teacher and do just good teaching without socio-political consciousness or having to affirm multiple identities in the classroom? Like, what if I think you could do a really bang up job without doing any of that? In fact, I know you can. Thus, she argues that culturally relevant pedagogy, all right, we said that, yet it is so rarely happening in our science classrooms. Substitute any subject and they'll agree. The people who are proponents of this. Yet it's so rarely happening in our ELA classrooms. Yet it's so rarely happening in our social studies classrooms. Yet it's so rarely happening. Maybe it's so rarely happening because it doesn't need to, because it's bunk. Ever think of that? You see all the assumptions? Like, this is a thing that has to happen. It's tied to their blackness and it's not happening. And that's a bad thing because it's just good teaching. So good teaching isn't happening. I'll grant you there's not a lot of good teaching happening, but I think more often than not, it's because of this garbage. Anyway, culturally responsive teaching. In slight contrast to the origins of culturally relevant teaching, Geneva Gay offered a broader conception of culturally responsive teaching. Gay, in essence, argued for a paradigmatic shift in the pedagogy used with non-middle class, non-European American students in U.S. schools. This is a call for the widespread implementation of culturally responsive teaching that addresses the multiculturalism found among students in the classroom. Again, there's this thing that we're told we have to address for these kids to learn based on superficial characteristics like what country of origin their parents, grandparents, etc. came from, or even maybe they came from if they're, a refugee or an immigrant or something like that. And I will grant you, if they're a refugee or an immigrant, that might be more relevant because now culturally responsive might mean you got to recognize that they don't speak English like at all. They don't understand the routines and the mores of the classroom. They come from a world where you got beaten in school, and so they're a little hesitant to go near the teacher. That would probably be important to be responsive to the people you actually have in your classroom, but not superficially, not every single teacher, not every single classroom, but in specific senses. And also, again, don't you think this ought to go without saying? If I'm teaching a classroom that's predominantly made up of, people who are refugees from a war-torn country, I would, being an intelligent person, go out of my way to learn about where they come from so I could relate to them. Again, this is common sense. This doesn't need a whole pedagogy or a bunch of books written about it. Common sense says I don't walk in there and start yammering away in English and acting like there's no difference between them and me. But okay, if you want to, emphasize it, that's fine. But like I said, they want to use this in every classroom around the country, irrespective of who's in there, including if it's an 80% white classroom. Well, what's going to happen then? But the 20% are not white, but maybe they're of a similar socioeconomic level. Maybe the last person who came from another country or another culture was like 3 or 4 generations ago. They speak English. They don't know anything about that country or that culture where they came from. And somebody's going to be coming at them with, we're going to be responsive to the culture of your ancestors based on the color of your skin. Aren't I up and with it and woke? They're spreading this far and wide across all the classrooms. And even in the ones where it's necessary, you got to draw the line between being responsive and projecting, right? There's that relevant versus responsive. Responsive makes a little more sense to me. Relevant, how the freak do you know what curriculum is relevant based on where the person allegedly came from or what their skin color is? That's a bridge too far for me. I don't know about you guys. Feel free to comment about that. But, what's relevant, it seems to me, is what's going to help the individual student be successful in the world where they live now, in their current reality, because that's where they live now. So even if you're being culturally responsive, I think the relevance, the cultural relevance, should be where you are right now. This country, the standards here, the language we speak predominantly here, the manners and mores here, because you live here. That's reality. And one would assume if people came as immigrants, they came here because they wanted to be here. So I don't think we should be assuming anything different than that when we go to teach them. So who chooses what's relevant? And moving on, let's says this is a call for the widespread implementation of culturally responsive teaching that addresses the multiculturalism, blah, blah. And then it says, Gay's notions of culturally responsive teaching insist that a different pedagogical model is needed to improve the performance of underachieving students from various ethnic groups. Gay explains that culturally responsive teaching is both routine and radical. Routine because it does for Native American, Latino, Asian American, African American, and low-income students what traditional instructional ideologies and actions do for middle-class European Americans. That is, it filters curriculum content and teaching strategies through their cultural frames of reference to make the content more personally meaningful and easier to master. Radical because it makes explicit the previously implicit role of culture in teaching and learning, and it insists that educational institutions accept the legitimacy and viability of ethnic group cultures in improving learning outcomes. This seems super insulting to me. Again, it really, really does. I think there's a fine line between taking people where they are and being respectful and observant about what feels like normal to them or what they're accustomed to, and gradually easing them into, again, the reality in which they live and are going to live and need to live if they're going to thrive, and not just remain stuck in whatever their marginalized status is or was, and making things a little more accessible to them by being relevant. I think you could cross that line pretty easily and start being like that white savior of putting everything again into the cultural relevant model, where it's like, surely you would prefer to learn this using hip hop. Let's talk about this through the framework of oral tradition and folk tales. We're not going to read novels. I mean, I don't know, but I just think you probably do better to err on the side of making sure they understand the language, making sure you're going at a pace that they can move at based on their individual abilities and how they're accustomed to routines, and ease them into, again, what the dominant culture is. Because if they want to go to college, they want to get jobs, they want to travel, they want to move around in our society and have upward mobility, that's kind of what they need to do. That's reality. So now that I've kind of given you the definition and my critique of culturally relevant and culturally responsive, I want to talk about the gap that I mentioned at the outset. You've heard about things like, origin, the cultures of origin of maybe their parents or grandparents. You've heard about ethnicities. You've heard about race. You've heard, so you're thinking countries. They learn about different countries when they're learning history other than America. They're like, well, make it relevant to them. Okay, is it really though? So for example, let's take the African American Studies program in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where they talk all about cultural relevance, and they're teaching about the kingdoms of Benin and Mali and things like that to children who may be ADOS. Do you think they're mentioning that the king of Benin was really insistent on continuing to sell human beings into bondage even when Western European abolitionists asked him not to? You think they're teaching that? No, we're going to talk about how much they contributed to civilization. Yeah, lots of free labor to build it. Awesome. But I bet you're not teaching that. So you're teaching children who are essentially American. They're American black children and American white children. You're teaching them about a culture that is not their culture. They're American. No, they may be a subculture within American culture of American black culture, I suppose. There are people who will discuss that, and I'm not proficient at that conversation. I'm not going to have that conversation, but I will say they're American. They live in America. They don't personally remember anything from Africa, most of them. And to the extent that some of them do, they probably, if I had to guess, feel a little insulted, like, why are we doing this? My parents brought me here from Africa so I could be American. What? I can learn this at home. I don't need you, white lady, or black lady, or black man, or white man, or whatever, who never experienced this and doesn't know anything about it, teaching it to me. It's, I want to learn how to be successful in this culture right here in this country. I'm American. So we're kind of separating these kids out, denying their Americanness, which seems odd and counterproductive to me, and then telling them all this stuff is so relevant to them. But is it? Is it? Which do you think is more relevant to their lives now in this reality and their future? Learning about what went on in these kingdoms of West Africa hundreds of years ago, or even what their culture is like today, or how Stalin rose to power or Hitler rose to power, how the Holocaust happened, how Mao rose to power, what the Cultural Revolution was, anything like that. I mean, I realize those were mostly like white people and Asian people that these things happened to, but given the events of the last 48 hours or so, don't you think it might be a little more relevant for them, relevant for them to understand, for example, how Hitler moved into the Sudetenland, and then after that, Poland, and how the policy of appeasement worked, and then how we ended up with the Holocaust? You think there might be some like synergy there? I mean, that's for the older kids, I grant you. But if we're talking about relevance, cultural relevance, they live in the West. They live in America. I mean, they don't live in Africa. They don't live in these places. Unless they're going to get up and move and go there, this isn't really relevant to them. Reading, writing, and doing math is relevant. And you can teach those things any which way you want, I suppose, as far as contextualizing them within some kind of cultural framework. But why would you? Like, why is that even necessary? Does it really make a giant difference to the kid? Is the kid going, I'm not learning that multiplication because you used, Timmy and Bobby as names instead of African names? Forget it. I'm not learning that. That's just so culturally insensitive. I just think that's insulting. I don't think that kids either are thinking that or miffed by it or need it. And it makes these marginalized groups, allegedly marginalized, I think it makes them seem like they are, fragile little pieces of glass that have to be handled a certain way or they can't learn. And I just see no evidence of that. I see no evidence of that whatsoever. I think getting the message across that you need special handling and we need to be very mindful of you and your special needs, and here they are as we've described them, sends a message to kids that they're weak or they need extra special help, and that doesn't really sound like empowerment to me. It just doesn't. Empowerment is you can learn the material I give you. That is related to the life you're living now in this culture. And then the other thing missing from this cultural relevance is any effort to have kids be culturally competent, culturally literate about people who live right here in this country who live different lives than they do. It all seems to be about race or ethnicity. But what about geographic region? What about class? What about, rural urban divide? What about white collar versus blue collar? How many kids do you think are walking around in, 8th grade, 9th grade, whatever, who don't have the foggiest idea what jobs you could do without a college degree and make really good money that are legal? Go poll your kids. Go find out. Ask if you have a kid in that age range. Go ask them, can you name like 5 jobs you can do without a college degree that pay very well, that may even pay better than some college degree jobs? See what they say. And then ask them how many people they've met in jobs like that. Now, some kids will have the advantage because their parents will be in one of those jobs. But how often is there sort of cross-cultural conversation within the classroom between those kids and the kids whose parents are in white-collar jobs? The laptop set. And how much more likely is it that in a school district, you have a divide between the white collar and the blue collar students that never gets discussed or crossed than, a divide that's racial, especially if they're growing up in the same, geographic area, the same zip code or whatever. There'll be some cultural differences, surely, but if they're in school together every day, that's something they're going to be exposed to. And if they're on, popular entertainment, social media, whatever, they're going to be exposed to that a lot more readily than they're going to be exposed to like how other people work and earn their living. How to, how they might want to treat people like that and talk to people like that and maybe even think about their own futures. There's a whole world of culture that we're not exposing our kids to. In fact, I see a lot of kids who only know about a few jobs. What do you want to be? I want to be a teacher. Who are they exposed to all day? They're exposed to teachers or they're pop culture icons. I want to be a YouTube gamer. I want to be a YouTuber. I want to be, a musician or a star of some kind, a celebrity. Ask them what a lineman does. They're like, no idea. They don't even know what that is. Like I said, ask them to name 5 jobs you can do and get paid well that don't require a college degree. Then ask them how many 5 jobs that require a college degree and see how mainstream and boring they are, and like that they're missing the whole world of work in the white collar world that's beyond that too. So their cultural competence is really low if we're talking about the culture in which they actually live. And you know how I know? You know how I know even that supposedly well-educated people are culturally illiterate? Is that during the pandemic, when everybody was being locked down, the laptop set or busy tweeting out, like, what is the big deal? Just, order DoorDash. What? Or they might, go to the grocery store that one time and just completely fail to understand where all the toilet paper went. Like, what happened? It must be those people hoarding it. Never dawned on them that there are supply chain issues or that you have a commercial supply chain and a consumer supply chain, and those things work differently and are, staffed by different people, literally different factories, different sets of trucks, different everything. They don't crisscross. Not easy to crisscross, a lot of red tape, a lot of government regulations. They don't know, but they're really smart. I have a Harvard degree. And then they would say things like, I'm looking to outfit my new home office. I'm working from home for the first time in a long time. I wanted to order a desk. And then I found out there was a 3-month delay. What is that about? I don't get what the big deal is. So then I tried to find somebody to come make me a desk, and I couldn't find anyone who had time to do it. Who builds desks? Where do I find someone who does that? And then they might find a carpenter and come to find out they have a 6 or 7 month wait list. They're so busy. I don't get it. Just send me a desk. Yes, that's my little Valley Girl voice or whatever. I use it whenever I want to convey cluelessness on the part of the speaker. They could be very well educated, but that's how I hear them in my head, because to me, that's the sound I hear when I read their tweets. When I read them saying things like, I don't get what's wrong. What's the problem? Just stay home. Like, just, order DoorDash. Just do this. Just do that. Put your kids on the computer. What is the problem? People who don't have kids, right? So where's their cultural competence? And how about the teachers themselves who would come into our living rooms and be saying things to our children, to us, etc., that were, oh, they just want their babysitter. Oh, they just didn't want to sit home and smoke pot, blah, 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 blah. Oh, yes, that's the person I want teaching my child about cultural competency and culture. That's culturally responsive. That you are making these huge assumptions about thousands of people on the other side of a screen. And if that's how they talk about the parents of the students, how do you think they treat the students? So do I even trust these people to be culturally responsive in a way that is truly meaningful? That's if I buy into, their little theories. Like I said, I don't buy into their theory, but I do buy into mine. That it is important to be culturally literate and culturally competent in the culture in which you actually live and in the reality in which you need to function as an adult. That does matter, because those are the people, the ones who are culturally incompetent go on to make policy that hurts a lot of people because they're culturally incompetent. So maybe we should shift away from teaching about places far away that we don't really understand, that we didn't come from, that our kids aren't going to grow up in or have to live in, and focus a little more on right here. And now feel free to go ahead and tell me what a bigot I am. That's fine. Like I said, I'm not suggesting we never teach kids about these faraway places, whatever. I just dispute the notion that we have to do that as a precursor to learning, that it's specific to Black children or ethnic children or whatever, and that cultural responsiveness is something that we have to do with every single classroom, not just the ones where it's obvious. And that cultural literacy excludes the culture in which you actually live. That dominant culture. Shh. We don't want to talk about that. That's a bad one. Anyway, that's the video. Thanks for watching. Again, please consider subscribing, liking, sharing, commenting. Have a great day.